everyone. Thank you all for joining us this evening. As Brittany mentioned, I am here to share some highlights from this year's annual report. The report comes out every April and showcases the Commission's recent accomplishments and also has a very big chapter on adult felony sentencing trends. And that is what I'm going to share with you all today. So, starting with the very basics, this chart shows the historical trends for the number of counts, cases, and individuals sentenced each year. In 2023, we saw a continuation of pre-pandemic trends where the number of counts, cases, and individuals all followed the gradual decline that was observed between 2017 and 2019. But in 2024, there was a substantial increase in all three of these metrics. And just to give you some specific data points, there is a 50% increase in the number of counts and a 47% increase in both the number of cases and defendants sentenced when compared to 2023. And what's interesting about this is that the 2024 trends very closely align with what we were seeing back in 2018. I also think it's really important to give some additional context here and mention that about half of all the cases that were sentenced in 2024 were filed in 2023. So on average, there were 11 months between case filing date and sentencing date for 2024 sentences. And that's just a good reminder that current sentencing trends are not necessarily reflective of current crime trends. So moving into the case disposition, this chart shows the distribution of disposition type. So whether the case was resolved through a plea agreement, a jury trial, or a bench trial. In 2023, we saw an increase in the proportion of cases that were resolved with the jury trial, and these increases continued in 2024. So 7.3% of all cases sentenced last year were disposed through a jury trial, which is a slight increase from 2023, but is the greatest rate that we have seen since 2015. In regard to disposition trends, what we saw in 2024 was very similar to 2023 and is on par with what we were seeing pre-pandemic as well. So next, looking at the sentence type distribution, and this analysis is presented on the case level, where each case is represented by the most severe count that was sentenced on the case. So one of the more interesting findings this year was the decrease in short split sentences. Historically, short split has represented about 20% of cases each year, and this has been really consistent over time. But in 2024, only 13.6% of cases received a short split sentence, which is the lowest rate that has ever been reported by the Commission. So this decrease was offset by an increase in probation sentences. Last year, approximately 1 in every 4 cases that was sentenced received a probation sentence. And the prison rate remained high. So last year, 61% of cases received a prison sentence, which is consistent with 2023. And I will mention that between 2015 and 2022, the average prison rate was 49%. So recently, we have been seeing a greater rate of prison sentences than we have in the past. A newer addition to the annual report is a deep dive into sentencing trends, or a deeper dive, I should say. And the main grid, which is shown here, provides judges with the recommended sentence that is based on the offense of conviction and the criminal history score of the individual being sentenced. So different colors on the grid represent different sentencing options, where white boxes are prison only, dark blue boxes are prison and short split, and light blue boxes are probation, short split, and prison. And something I do want to emphasize is that prison is an available sentencing option in every single box on the grid. So this chart shows the distribution of sentence type within each colored region of the main grid. And what I think is really important to point out about this analysis, and is what often might be a common misconception of the guidelines, is that just because someone falls into a probation eligible box does not necessarily mean that they are going to get a probation sentence. So if you look at the far right column of this chart, which represents the light blue probation eligible boxes on the grid, you'll see that 43% of these convictions actually resulted in a probation sentence. 20% received short split, and 37% received a prison sentence. So when combined, this means that over half of defendants in a probation eligible box ended up being sentenced to either probation or short split, not prison. So the big takeaway here is that the color of the box does not necessarily determine the sentence that will be imposed. So next is an analysis on the offense type, which we have broken out into broad categories. Homicide, sex, and violent offenses are classified as violent. Weapon, property, and other are classified as nonviolent, and drug offenses just stay in their own category as drugs. So overall, there were 740 more counts sentenced in 2024 than in 2023. And that being said, it is expected to see increases in the total numbers that are reported across trends for this past year. But there are a couple of interesting things that I do want to point out aside from the dramatic increases. So the first is for nonviolent counts, which are represented by the red line. And nonviolent offenses increased from 837 to 1,235. And this is the greatest number of nonviolent offenses that has ever been recorded by the Commission. This increase is mostly due to an increase in weapons offenses, though property and other offenses did have an increased number of counts as well, but weapons offenses were the primary driver here. Violent offenses also increased. And what's interesting here is that the number of homicide offenses and the number of sex offenses did not change at all compared to 2023. So this increase is solely attributed to an increase in violent offenses, primarily due to increases in robbery and assault with a dangerous weapon convictions. And lastly, drug offenses, which substantially increased for the first time since 2017. So the number of drug offenses nearly tripled in 2024, but as you can see, they are still well below pre-pandemic levels. And this pie chart shows the breakdown of the counts sentenced in 2024 by offense type. Violent and weapons offenses were the two most frequently sentenced categories and represented about 70% of all felony counts when combined. Drug offenses represented 9% of all counts. And as a reminder, last year we hit an all-time low for drug offenses. They only represented 4.7% of sentences. So this year we did see a pretty notable increase in drug offenses. And now I'm going to hone in on the sentencing trends for weapons offenses since they are our top offense category. Specifically looking at trends for the two most frequently sentenced offenses, or two most frequently sentenced weapons offenses, which are carrying a pistol without a license and felon in possession. So CPWL was the top weapon offense, representing 43% of all weapons counts and 17% of all felony counts sentenced last year. Felon in possession represented 31% of all weapons offenses and 12% of all felony counts. So combined, these two top gun possession offenses accounted for about 1/3 of all the sentences imposed in 2024. And this is consistent with what we saw in 2023 as well. So the chart shows the distribution of sentence type for both offenses. And as you can see, probation, represented by this green box, was the dominant sentence type for CPWL in 2024. And it was imposed at a rate of 49%. And this is actually an increase from the previous year, where the probation rate for this offense was only 39%. On the other hand, felon in possession has a very high prison rate, and that is attributed to the 1-year mandatory minimum that applies for this offense. So it is expected to see that a vast majority of these counts did result in a prison sentence. Next, moving into guidelines compliance. So in 2024, 95.5% of felony sentences were compliant in the box, meaning that both the sentence type and the sentence length were within the guidelines recommendation. And this is the greatest in the box compliance rate that has ever been observed by the Commission. And now moving into one of the newer features of the annual report, which is the arrest to sentencing analysis. And before I get into the data, I do want to go over the methodology for this type of analysis. It can be a little complicated. So the arrest to sentencing analysis is the analysis that we do to track a case from initial arrest all the way through final disposition and sentencing. Like all of the other analyses produced by the Commission, we are only looking at adult arresting cases. So juveniles are not included in any of the Commission's data. A big component of this analysis is the papering rate. And the way that the Commission determines whether an arrest has been papered is by matching the arrest number that is provided by the Metropolitan Police Department to an arrest number that is in the data that we get from DC Superior Court. If the MPD arrest number is also present in the court's data, then the arrest is marked as papered, and if not, then it's marked as no papered. And there are some limitations with this. So the biggest of which is that we are not capturing any arrests where charges are not immediately filed after the arrest is made. The second limitation is that we do not include any charges that are brought to US District Court simply because we do not get district court data. We also look at the disposition of cases that are filed as a result of an arrest being papered. However, we only look at the outcomes of non-fugitive cases. So, because a single arrest can result in fugitive cases only or can result in multiple non fugitive cases, it is rare for the number of papered arrests to exactly match the number of cases that have been filed in a given time period. So, in 2024, there were 5,761 adult felony arrests made in DC. 72% of these arrests were papered, generating a total of 4,319 non fugitive cases filed in DC Superior Court. As of January of this past year, 20% of these cases were closed without conviction, 32% resulted in a finding of guilt for any criminal offense that could be felony or misdemeanor offenses, and just under half are still pending disposition. So this was just a taste of the type of data and analyses that are featured in this year's annual report. I will say that certain analyses do go into much more detail in the actual report. We do have a full arrest to sentencing analysis for gun possession offenses that actually explores the sentences that are imposed for those two offenses. So if you haven't checked out the report yet, I highly recommend you do so. It recently was published to our website, and we also have a couple of hard copies that have been delivered to our office. So with that being said, thank you everyone for attending. I hope you found today's presentation interesting and informative. And with that, I will pass it back to Brittany.